For as long as Deltarune has been available to the public, the exact content of the game's all-important prophecy have been called into question by a lot of people. There was once a time where many theorized that Lancer was the Prince from the Dark rather than Ralsei. Many once believed that Ralsei was just outright lying to us and would betray us in a later chapter. And some once genuinely believed that Papyrus is the Roaring Knight. I mean, like, who the hell would ever believe something stupid as that, am I right? But ever since the release of chapters 3 and 4 back in June of 2025, the validity of the prophecy has been more contentious than ever. Like, what the hell is going on with the last prophecy? Does Deltarune actually only have one ending? Is the player actually the angel, or is it someone or something else? And what the hell is gallery even supposed to mean? Unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that last question yet, since Google keeps refusing to give me a definition for some reason, but those first three I think I might have found the answer to, at least to a certain extent. I genuinely feel so absurdly confident about the main crux of this theory being true, and every day I keep finding more and more pieces of evidence pointing toward this being correct. Before I begin though, I should probably mention that I am not the first person to come up with this conclusion. This theory borrows a lot of ideas from other theories that I've seen, and is mostly a hodgepodge of those other theories smashed together with some of my own ideas. So if anything sounds familiar to you, there's a good chance that I didn't originally come up with it on my own. I'll try to remember which theories I'm borrowing from whenever I can, and I'll have all of their videos linked in the description below in case you want to check them out, which I would highly recommend you do. They're all very good. Either way, this is the theory that I firmly believe, for the most part, is the answer to Deltarune's late game. So stay for a minute if you will, if you have the time, while I guide you through what I believe to be where Deltarune's story is heading. This is what I have dubbed the interpretation theory, because I just could not come up with a better name than that. And it all starts with... A little background on Gerson for those who need a refresher. Gerson Boom was a character who showed up in Undertale as the shopkeeper of Waterfall. He clearly has a lot of storied history, having helped to train Undyne to become the warrior she is back when he was still the Hammer of Justice. And he's also the one to tell you about the Deltarune symbol and its meaning in the world of Undertale. He's a fun character, as is most of Undertale's cast, though he unfortunately doesn't have too much relevance in Undertale's overall story, albeit he's still important to a degree. So there's not really a whole lot to talk about him here outside of the stuff that I'm saving for later. So, fast forward all the way to Deltarune Chapter 1, and he fucking dies. Okay, let's rewind a little bit. It's explained to Deltarune that while Gerson was still alive, he was a legendary author, writing a renowned book series called Lord of the Hammer. When Gerson is resurrected as a Darkner in Chapter 4, he talks a bit about Lord of the Hammer, giving a whole crash course summary of the first 5 books during his boss fight. Chapter 1, March of the Dark King. The heroes defeat the king and stop the dragon. Chapter 2, The City of the Shining. The heroes do battle in chariots to save the queen. Chapter 3, The Isles of Northernly. The heroes travel among the islands and catch a glimpse of a lost land. Chapter 4, The Trials of the Holy Hammer. A great smith gives the heroes a terrible weapon. In Chapter 5, The Field of Pink and Gold. The vast garden is charred in an inferno of jealousy. He then explains how after Chapter 5, there was only ever one more book released before the story became so grand, so overwhelming. Some say it swallowed up the author himself. The last book was never written, as no one else was willing to write that next page. It's also important to note about Gerson that he doesn't really seem to believe in the prophecy at all. He calls it a fairy tale and doesn't really take it that seriously. Even after shattering one of the prophecy panels shortly after you meet him to reveal a path forward towards his study, he can say this. Well now, a fairy tale is a pretty little thing. Ain't it nice to believe a glimmer here and there? I just think those words shine a bit too bright. Path so blue it's all you can see. So I say, why don't we go between the lines? It's darker there. However, it's during his boss fight, as well as Gerson's dialogue afterwards, that an absolute czar bomba of a confirmation is dropped. As it turns out, the in-universe video game series Dragon Blazers is based on Lord of the Hammer. And Lord of the Hammer is based on the prophecy. So anytime that the plot of either of these two things are referenced, it's most likely a hint towards something that will happen later on in Deltarune. I mean, yeah, that's kind of what we already thought beforehand, but there's another important detail here to make note of. Notice how I said that they are based on the prophecy. They're not a recreation of it, they're just based on it. Because what Gerson tells the Fun Gang after beating him is the single biggest piece of evidence behind this entire theory, and it's the reason that I even came to this conclusion in the first place. Lord of the Hammer, huh? Hell if I'm reading that. Though, wait a sec. Isn't that what Dragon Blazers was based on? Yep, and so they changed parts of the story. Of course, the biggest fans got mad. But isn't it interesting? The book was already just an interpretation of something else. Stories can be retold. They can be changed. That's what I believe. So, 2 in-universe stories that have been referenced multiple times throughout the game already are said to have been reinterpretations of the prophecy. They aren't exactly the same, but they follow the same general idea as the prophecy, and by proxy, the actual events of Deltarune. And since we're here, I might as well just get this out of the way now, since I imagine some of you might be able to tell where this is going. I very firmly believe that Gerson is foreshadowing that Deltarune will have multiple endings that are all reinterpretations of whatever the last prophecy is. In fact, I think that multiple parts of the prophecy can probably change based on how it can be interpreted. If there is one singular idea that you should take away from this theory, it is this point right here. Everything else that I cover in this video relies on this statement being true. That's how confident I am that this is correct. But first, to provide some extra context, let's shift gears a bit and talk about literature. I promise this is relevant. No, this is not a sponsored segment. Please don't leave. If any of you are my fellow English majors out there, you'll probably already know by now that all literature has a damn near infinite number of ways to interpret it. No matter who you are, though, you've probably already seen the whole "the curtains are blue" meme on the internet a billion times now. And maybe some of you have also gotten really used to using the phrase "it's not that deep" whenever talking about a story's larger themes and metaphors and whatnot. Well, I'm here to tell you that while yes, your high school teacher probably did in fact lose the plot like you suspected, in a majority of cases, it actually is that deep. In fact, even if your teacher did lose the plot, whatever their interpretation of a story is probably still valid regardless of what the author has to say about it. Maybe the blue curtains do signify the main character's depression, or that, I don't know, like a simple banana is a metaphor for like capitalism or something. I don't know, who cares? That's the beauty of it. It can be literally anything, and as long as you have the evidence to back that up, there is no interpretation that's incorrect. That is, unless you are trying to do something such as interpret Chris's pronouns as anything other than they, them. Stop doing that, you look like an idiot. If an interpretation can be outright proven as incorrect, that is not an interpretation, you are just wrong. I swear to God, if I see any of you try to use this theory as justification for any sort of bigotry whatsoever, I will personally feed you to the tail of hell. Tangent aside, anyone could interpret almost anything about a story they read, as Gerson seems to agree with me here. But what about the author's intended meaning of a story? What happens when that gets thrown to the wayside in favor of another idea? Well, then you get the phenomenon known as death of the author. This is the idea that the author's interpretation of a work does not matter at all once it's published. The only thing that matters is what the reader interprets a story to be about. Writer's intentions be damned. So, outside of just explaining what Gerson already told us he believes, what does any of what I just talked about have to do with Deltarune? Well, for one, Gerson is quite literally a dead author. The guy that thinks stories can be retold and changed. The guy that tells you to read between the lines because it's darker there. The author of an award-winning book series, probably the most famous author in Hometown by a mile and a half, is dead. This is such an on-the-nose thing that I cannot help but believe that this was intentional. This is literally a play on words about someone who believes that stories can have more than one meaning, who also happens to be very notably deceased. Why wouldn't this mean something given who Gerson is? But even outside of that detail, all of this tells us exactly where Deltarune is going. For example, let's circle back to Undertale Gerson for a bit, since there's an important detail about his dialogue that I conveniently skipped over earlier. The legend of the Deltarune according to Undertale's universe. Gerson explains how the Deltarune supposedly tells of a prophecy which states that an angel who has seen the surface will arrive in the underground and make it go empty. He explains how many people take it literally, that an actual angel will descend underground and break the barrier to set the monsters free. But others have recently taken on a more pessimistic interpretation of it, believing that the so-called angel is actually an angel of death, and that the underground will go empty as the angel kills everyone down there. The most obvious interpretation of this is that the player is the angel. I guess Frost could technically work here as well, but I personally like player angel more, so I'm just gonna stick with that. Hint hint. The prophecy here is clearly meant to allude to the pacifist and genocide endings of Undertale, a route where you make peace with everyone, and a route where you slaughter everyone. And obviously you've seen the surface, so it's pretty cut and dry, right? In Undertale, the player is the prophecy's angel. Okay, well, one, let's not glance over the fact that Undertale's prophecy is explicitly stated to have more than one way to interpret it that is then reflected in the gameplay. But even disregarding that, what if I told you that there was someone else who could also be the angel based off of this description? Here's why Asriel is also the angel in Undertale. Firstly, the most straightforward connection being a part of his inspiration. Azrael's name comes from a bunch of different places, though one of the more obvious ones to point to is probably, I'm just gonna assume this is pronounced Azrael, the biblical angel of death in some religions. This guy's name is partially based off of an actual angel, the angel of death no less, so I feel like the connection there should be pretty straightforward. But beyond just that, the things that Azrael does at the end of the game also match what the angel is said to do in the prophecy, no? He's obviously seen the surface before, having crossed the barrier just before getting killed by the humans, and he not only also absorbs the souls of every living being in the underground, making it go empty under that definition, he also then uses the souls to break the barrier after he's defeated, once again letting the underground go empty. We never do that. Frisk never does that, because Azrael does that for us. He's also just straight up called the god of hyperdeath during his fight, and his second form looks a lot like a certain symbol I've seen somewhere. So Azrael can also be interpreted as the angel in Undertale's prophecy, as can we, and as can Frisk, even though Azrael Angel is beyond the prophecy's most straightforward meaning, which ironically I think is actually intentional. The angel's identity is entirely dependent on who you think it is. But that's Undertale. Surely the exact same godlike philosophy isn't also applicable in Deltarune as well, right? Right, guys? So, what do we know about the angel in Deltarune? They're revered as a god in Hometown, there's this thing in the prophecy called the Angel's Heaven, the angel Banish will finally meet with his desire, and that's about it for direct mentions. But there have been a lot of other connections to this so-called angel to a couple other characters. The most popular theory that I've seen for who the angel is like Undertale, the player. And there was a lot of compelling evidence for this. There's the angel doll falling on top of the soul in Chapter 4, the sentence, "Let the angel's power light your way," feels really suspicious after the scene at the end of Chapter 4 where we basically use the soul as a flashlight. The idea of banishing the angel's heaven could be referring to banishing us from having access to Deltarune. The fact that Deltarune is a parallel game to Undertale and the player angel just makes sense in that context, and probably way more than just this that I'm just blanking on. But it's a popular theory for a reason. There's genuinely a lot going for it. But I personally think that there is an even stronger angel candidate that the game has been foreshadowing even more than just the player. More than anything else in this entire theory, even more so than the entire thesis statement of the theory itself. I am 100% absolutely disgustingly confident that Deltarune's final boss, the Angel, will be none other than Noelle Holiday. This, in of itself, is entirely its own separate theory that could take up half the video by itself. So let me just quickly give you the broad strokes of why I'm so convinced that this is going to happen. Noelle's entire family is Christmas themed, tying them all back to the angel inherently. Noelle is constantly referred to as Angel throughout Chapter 2, especially in the Weird Route. She even says herself during the Ferris wheel scene that since she thinks she's dreaming, she could just jump out of the carriage, grow massive angel wings, and start flying around. Noelle's Dark World outfit is reminiscent of an angel. There's the unused prophecy panel in Chapter 4 that says cold water fell from the top of the sky. Noelle is very famous for being associated with the snow. There's this poem at the end of the 2024 winter newsletter that ends with, "I wish it could snow whenever I wanted," and talks about her snow angels being the biggest ones left over after dust cleared the rest of them out. There's the scrapped cave painting shown off in an official Undertale art book depicting an angelic figure with deer antlers surrounded by the Deltarune while fighting a giant dragon. Guess who? Noelle's home life is also really rough. Her sister has been missing for God knows how many years now, her dad is probably on his deathbed, and she is absolutely terrified of her mom. So say, hypothetically, that she were to learn that the cyber world was in fact not a dream she had, and that the Dark Worlds were actually real in Chapter 5. Especially if Rudy dies in a later chapter like I suspect he might, then I see no reason why Noelle wouldn't want to create a dark fountain herself where everything could be hit with just a little spell and maybe she could bring her father back. That's a perfect reason for the Angel's Heaven to exist, why Noelle will be the final boss, and for the love of God, she says herself that she was the angel in a holiday pageant. It does not get more blatantly obvious that this is foreshadowing, and I am shocked that more people have not realized this yet. Okay, maybe I got a little passionate writing that script. If you disagree, it's really not that big of a deal, I promise. I'm sorry. But regardless of that, you can see how both Player Angel and Noelle Angel are really compelling theories, right? Both of them bring up some very valid points that make both arguments very strong, in my opinion. In my eyes, at least, they're both probably the angel, but just in a different way. Noelle in a literal sense, and the player in a much more indirect sense. What reason would there be for the true angel of the prophecy to not have multiple interpretations like in Undertale? I don't really see why they couldn't just both be the angel, even if I happen to prefer one interpretation over the other. I mean, that's the beauty of stories after all. They can be retold, they can be changed. There won't always be one definitive answer to a question, but no matter how you look at it, it's still the same story. Actually, Toby Fox does this like double meaning, multi-interpretable sort of thing a lot in both of his games, unrelated to just the story. The word determination is also intentionally meant to be read as determination. But it refused can also be read as but it refused, and what kind of monster are you on the genocide route is meant in both how nobody in the underground even registers you as human anymore, and also how you become a figurative quote-unquote monster after killing everyone. And even outside of that, there are a lot of other things that are left up to interpretation as to what is actually happening. Like, for example, with the ending cutscene in the genocide route with Kara. I don't think it's a stretch to say that double meanings and intentional ambiguity are very common tools used in both Undertale and Deltarune, and that Deltarune seems to be taking the whole interpretation angle and making it a much bigger focus. But how can this way of thinking apply to the rest of Deltarune's prophecy then? Let's finally address the Deltarune FAQ-shaped elephant in the room. One of the questions on this FAQ that can be found on Deltarune's official website asks, how many endings will Deltarune have? To which Toby Fox responds, 1. The follow-up question to that asks if that means that none of our choices will matter in Deltarune if there is only one ending. Toby's response to that, there is something more important than reaching the end. So, case closed, theory debunked, and Pants pissed out of sheer anger. There's clearly only one ending, right? Even Ralsei is hell-bent on there only being one ending, even calling Susie's hope naive for believing that they all might be able to avoid the tragedy of the last prophecy. But hang on a second, there's absolutely no way that Ralsei is correct in his belief, right? It's already very possible to go off the beaten path in Deltarune. Case in point, I just psychologically manipulated this lesbian teenage anthropomorphic deer girl into turning her study buddy who probably has a very unhealthy obsession with the Wii U and the frozen chicken. None of these words are in the Bible. And even then, Susie is constantly doing things that Ralsei doesn't expect her to, despite Ralsei having the entire prophecy memorized. Like how she makes him learn R action, or how she takes him off to go explore the city without Chris. So all signs are clearly pointing to there being more than one ending. But then, why would Toby be so insistent that there's only one? Well, let's consider what we learned from Gerson. Stories can be changed. They can be altered to better suit someone's interpretation or otherwise rewritten somehow, despite still being the same story at the end of the day. And since he makes a point to mention that Dragon Blazers is based on Lord of the Hammer is based on the prophecy, I think it's reasonable to conclude that Deltarune only has one ending by technicality. I mean, yeah, it is still just the last prophecy, but it can be read multiple ways, and those interpretations will be the major ending differences are, which, once again, is exactly what Undertale does. I heard someone point out at some point, I'm pretty sure it was Spooky Dude, sorry if I'm wrong on that each individual playthrough of Deltarune is already its own slightly different version of the story. You can either fight King or spare him, and the ending to Chapter 1 changes based on what you choose, albeit still generally reaches the same conclusion. Same thing with Queen in Chapter 2. Fighting her or sparing her yields a different outcome for Birdley, but the end cutscene doesn't change. All of the Shadow Crystals are optional outside of Spamtons on the Weird Route, so not everyone will find and defeat all of the secret bosses on every playthrough. You don't even have to get all of the recruits, and there are consequences for doing so and not doing so. Whatever actually happens in Deltarune isn't consistent on every playthrough, but it's still the same story. And Ralsei's belief that there's only one ending despite all of this evidence against that actually has a pretty simple possible explanation for it. Ralsei is only aware of one very specific interpretation of the prophecy, whether that be the intended meaning or not. I don't know, I'll elaborate more on that later. He literally cannot see any other path forward because he can't read the prophecy in any other way than what was given to him when he was born. Of course he can't see another interpretation. He's lived his whole life assuming that this is just how it is without ever realizing that it's possible to look at it another way. So already, Deltarune has a ton of ways to interpret the events of its story. I want to look more specifically at the endings though, because I imagine those will yield the most drastically different changes compared to everything else that I've mentioned so far. I currently believe that Deltarune will likely have at least 3 major quote-unquote endings that depend on the route you take. Yes, I said 3. 1 for the normal route, 1 for the weird route, and an even more secret third option that involves the Twisted Sword after an aborted weird route. The normal route and completed weird route are self-explanatory. It's literally just complete the routes, nothing fancy going on here. But I would like to briefly propose that the Twisted Sword is a far more important item than most people seem to think. And that is saying a lot. In my opinion, there was almost certainly going to be no way to bring the Thorn Ring into Castletown while you are locked into the weird route post-Chapter 4. It's attached to Noelle's finger, and it's clearly being used as a way for us to control her. I think it's highly unlikely that it will ever be unequivocable on the weird route after Chapter 4. But how would you get the Twisted Sword in that case, which requires the Thorn Ring plus what is likely to be all 5 Shadow Crystals for the sake of the Pure Crystal? Well, that's actually pretty easy to answer. Start the weird route in Chapter 2, and then continue it up until you've purchased the Thorn Ring from Spamton, and then just never equip it to Noelle. It stays in your inventory the whole time, and you can progress the game normally without ever needing to Snowgrave Birdley. Now, there shouldn't be anything stopping you from keeping it all the way up until you have the Pure Crystal, then bringing it to Malleus and Castletown to create the Twisted Sword easy as pie. The Twisted Sword isn't a Weird Route item, it's an aborted Weird Route item. Because of how far out of the way that the Twisted Sword would be in this case, not to mention the Trance Down effect being the exact opposite of the Thorn Ring's Trance Up effect, implying that we would have less control over Chris, I think that there is a very strong case to be made here that the Twisted Sword might lead to a third major ending. Now, I don't want to spend too much longer on this topic, since I quite frankly don't have a concrete idea on what the ending to this route would look like, so instead I'll have another video linked in the description below that goes far more in-depth than I do here if you want to hear more. I just wanted to bring this up just because I thought it was important and interesting. You are so lucky. But now, I want to discuss the other two endings, since there's a lot more for me to talk about here that is actually relevant to this theory. Namely, I want to talk about the identity of the second hero of the prophecy. The girl with hope crossed on her heart. Please don't leave, please don't leave. I know that this is going to piss some people off, please don't leave. I'm going to preface this section by saying that I'm pretty shaky on most of the theory from here on out. I could definitely see all of this happening, but I also think that there's a chance that I'm just completely off the mark. But I still think it's possible, so might as well talk about it. So, with that out of the way, who the hell is this referring to? The interpretation that the game clearly wants you to believe on a surface level is that this is referring to Susie. I mean, why wouldn't it be, right? Who else would it be if not for Susie? It seems obvious. But especially when Chapter 4 first released, a lot of people noticed that this drawing of the second hero doesn't look entirely like Susie. Mark isn't canon, shut up. Or at least rather, it might fit Noelle's silhouette better with the longer hair and cloaked appearance. Notably, Noelle is also able to equip both the Black Shard and the Jingle Blade, whereas Susie can't equip any swords at all, making it much less sensible for Susie to be the one holding a sword in this picture. Plus, if this were Noelle, the phrase "love finds its way to the girl" would hold a lot more meaning, since you could also read it as "love finds its way to the girl," as in Undertale's definition of love, an acronym for levels of violence, which could thereby allude to the Weird Route under that interpretation. And the second girl that the prophecy mentions, which, yes, I believe that the prophecy speaks of two girls, not just the one, uses the Rude Buster symbol to represent her. So obviously, Noelle is actually the second hero and Susie is just whoever that other girl is, right? Okay, so firstly, let's justify Susie holding a sword for a moment. It's literally just the white pen of hope that Gerson mentions. Chris's sword in the Dark World is a pencil. There is every possible reason for Susie to eventually use a sword in a later chapter. Boom, there we go. That's why it's a sword if this is Susie. The second hero was also very notably not depicted with antlers like Noelle has, which feels like it would be a pretty odd thing to exclude if this was really her. Plus, the Rude Buster symbol isn't just used for Rude Buster, it's used for several different actions. I mean, the silhouette also doesn't not look like Susie, and it could be that we're just reading too much into it. But then why have the other girl's prophecy panel literally specifically labeled as Rude Buster in the game files? And what even is the role of the second girl at all? As I established earlier, Susie is clearly capable of breaking off of Ross's interpretation of the prophecy. She has always been a rebel who doesn't like to follow the rules, doing what she wants when she wants. Her entire character is someone who forges her own path forward, despite what fate has already decided for her. So would it not make a ridiculous amount of narrative sense for Noelle to have originally been the intended second hero, but then somehow Noelle and Susie ended up swapping places? If Susie is the dragon in Lord of the Hammer, wouldn't that make her more of a villain than anything? Gerson does say that in the book, the heroes defeat the king and stop the dragon, and Susie does side with Lancer for most of Chapter 1, acting as an antagonist to Chris and Relsa. What if Susie was always meant to be the bad guy, but something happened to cause her to become a hero and Noelle the quote-unquote antagonist? It's another reinterpretation of the prophecy, where the girls swap roles. It matches up with Susie's character, it gives more of a reason for there to be another Susie crash-out/fight later on, and honestly, in my opinion, it just feels like it would be a natural progression of Susie's story, where she realizes that she was never supposed to be the second hero. She really was always meant to be the bad guy. But then, in the end, she'll still end up the second hero anyways. She'll realize that she does hold the white pen of hope, and can fulfill the role in the prophecy that she wants to, not what the prophecy has already chosen for her. And this will all play out during the normal ending, whatever it may be, where the last prophecy is reinterpreted to something perhaps still not preferred, but way better than the intended meaning of it. Alright, that's great and all, but how does this differ from the Weird Route? I'm getting there, just hang with me for another paragraph. Remember that unused cave painting of the angel and the dragon that I briefly mentioned during the Noelle rant earlier? I think that this scenario is extremely likely to play out in Deltarune, where at least a part of the final boss will be a clash between these two giant forces. In the normal route, it would be you fighting Noelle with a giant transformed Susie at your side. Another YouTuber you might have heard of called Nighthawk suggested in one of his videos that something like this could come about if Susie ends up absorbing the player's soul after Chris somehow gets killed, thus creating a transformation similar to the god of Hyperdeath like we see in Undertale. As for Noelle, there are a bunch of possible explanations, but I'd honestly not go even deeper into fanfic territory than I feel like I really need to, so I'm just not going to delve into that for now. Either way, I think this is a pretty strong idea, and I'd highly recommend checking out Nighthawk's video, link in the description. Just brief warning, it's more character analysis than theory. I don't know why I said it just is character analysis, it's not theory. So what happens in the weird route then? I think that the weird route is most likely going to try to force Noelle back into the role of the second hero. We intentionally try to make her stronger in Chapter 2 by freezing all of the darkness there, and then we take full control back over her in Chapter 4, hence love finds its way to the girl. After forcing the Thornwing back onto her, we start seeing this little red dot show up in a couple of scenes, and during the end cutscene of Chapter 4 on the weird route, we see the same red dot again, but it's bigger, it's growing in size. What we just did here, at least in my opinion, is that we inserted another soul inside of Noelle for us to eventually control her with. Again, this is not my idea to be clear, but I think it's probably the best explanation for what's actually going on here. At some point, the red dot will grow into a full-size soul and will have full control over Noelle to do our evil doings. So if we get to control the person who's supposed to be the final boss, then what the hell happens at the end? Well, Noelle and Susie swap places again. Noelle and Susie both have their giant transformations, but then we get to fight Susie as the final boss instead. Because if and when Susie realizes what we're doing to Noelle, of course she'd try fighting us to try to save her friend. Or, you know, whatever the hell these two will have going on by that point in the game. I don't know. Point is, the game still ends with the same big battle, it's just that the roles of two of the characters have swapped based on two different ways of reading the prophecy. But then the angel still has to be banished, so maybe it's an unwinnable fight, or maybe it's technically winnable, but afterwards the angel still dies. Or maybe even Susie's the angel in this context, which, honestly, I really like that idea. None of this is bulletproof, but all of these ideas are what I personally have taken most fondly to. If anyone else has any better ideas, though, feel free to discuss them in the comments. Just please, for the love of God, be civil, that's all I ask. I know I'm asking a lot, we're all Deltarune fans, we're all on the internet, please, just don't kill each other, or don't threaten to kill each other. I please. There is one part of this whole swapping roles in the prophecy thing that I haven't yet acknowledged, though. How exactly did Susie and Noelle swap places to begin with? I mean, that's just a crazy thing to say without elaborating, right? What explanation for that could there even possibly be? It's Gaster. Gaster swapped Noelle and Susie's roles in the prophecy. I am genuinely very sorry if you thought that this was going to be a Gaster-free theory and are sick of hearing about this guy by now, but I do think I have an idea as to what he's up to, assuming everything I talked about regarding Susie and Noelle just now is correct. If not, then this part of the theory kind of just almost completely collapses in on itself, but I still think I'm onto something. I'm not just randomly bringing him up because, ooh, spooky unexplained thing equals Gaster, I think glue is delicious. No, I genuinely believe Gaster being the culprit behind this makes the most sense here. But, we've run into a pretty big problem now. Not with the theory itself, even though I already know that this part of the theory in particular has a couple holes in it. No, the problem I now have to deal with is the now impending release date of Chapter 5. I frankly don't think I'm going to have enough time to finish this video before the release of the chapter anymore, and I'm going to try my hardest to get what I have here out before then, but worry not because I have a plan. Because I at least still want to touch on the Gaster tangent of the second half of this video, what I'm going to do instead is briefly summarize everything that I would have gone over into deeper detail about here that I didn't get to yet. And then after Chapter 5 releases, depending on what new information we get, I may or may not release a follow-up video to this one that would more or less be a revised version of the second half of this script, plus any other important revisions to be made with this video that you are currently watching. There's no guaranteeing that I make that second part of the video though, so just be wary that it might not happen depending on how I'm feeling. That's part of why I'm summarizing all of my initial thoughts here, to at least get them out before they become outdated. And one last warning beforehand, a lot of this part of the theory is very speculative and definitely lands in fanfiction territory, so take all of this with a grain of salt. So, to finally summarize what I would have said, I strongly believe that Gaster wrote the prophecy for the sake of experimenting with the nature of freedom as an extension of his studies with determination. I also think, however, that he wrote the prophecy in such a way where Noelle was the second hero and Susie was the antagonist. But he then intentionally set up Deltarune's world somehow, so that Susie ends up becoming the second hero and Noelle the final antagonist, or the angel if you will. The reason he would have done this was to see if the prophecy could still be fulfilled by someone who was never meant to fulfill it, or if fate would just naturally force everything back into what it was intended to be. Furthermore, Gaster also seems to have experimented on a few select Darkners as well, to see if they could handle the level of freedom that he sought for himself, those Darkners being Jevil, Spamton, and Gerson. Jevil flat out couldn't handle the knowledge of the prophecy's existence in tandem with the knowledge that nothing he does matters because he's merely just a character in a video game. Spamton could handle that freedom, but he was ultimately coerced by Tenna into sharing that freedom with him, which went against the deal Spamton had made with Gaster. And yes, I believe Gaster is Spamton's color. After Gaster vanished on him, Spamton then went insane trying to reclaim the freedom he once had. And then Gerson, being a deceased Lightner who was still fondly remembered by what is probably millions of living Lightners, is already content with what he has as a Darkner, making him completely disinterested in any of the power that Gaster could provide him. Why the Knight has a Shadow Crystal is another theory for another time, but thus far, it seems like Gaster's experiments have proven mostly unsuccessful, which is part of the reason why he's so fascinated by the player, a being that exists outside of Deltarune's universe like he does, that presumably would have enough ability to handle having freedom within Deltarune's world without going insane in the process. He needs you to fully realize his Deltarune, because you are the only thing that is capable of wielding the necessary amount of freedom and, by proxy, determination to do so. Since a being with enough determination naturally has an absurd amount of freedom over the world, being able to save and reload and all that. Ultimately, I believe that Gaster is actually doing all of this for his own gain, and that he is actually Deltarune's true main antagonist. If he could somehow replicate or even extract the amount of determination / freedom from the soul, even though you're not technically all that free, you're stuck with Chris, but just hear me out, he could use that for himself to write his own story, to defy his own fate as a simple royal scientist who suddenly vanished one day without a trace. This conflict will inevitably lead to a true final boss fight against Gaster following a final fight against Noelle, or Susie on the weird route as the Angel, leading to every entity that could fit the role of the Angel finally meeting with their desire following banishment. For Noelle, this would probably be seeing her sister again. For Susie, assuming that she is considered the Angel on the weird route, I'm admittedly unsure of exactly what this would be, but my best guess would probably be for the soul to stop tormenting her friends, or just, for her eternal suffering to finally end. Jesus Christ, why the hell did I write that? As for Gaster and the player, they both likely share the same goal, to see the ending of Deltarune's story. But even if Gaster wants to see the end of Deltarune for his own villainous reasons, Deltarune still can't end without him being defeated. And so even with Gaster's defeat, no matter who you think the true Angel is, the Angel after banishment will always finally meet with its desire. And, yeah, that's honestly really all that I wanted to say on this. Before wrapping this video up, though, I have one last little tangent that I want to go on that's completely unrelated to the rest of the theory. No, Image Friend is not going to be Chapter 5 Secret Boss. No way that a character that is being set up to be as important as they are will be that out of the way to find. I have seen so many people theorize that they're going to be the secret boss, and it drives me insane every time. How I see it, the only realm that exists in which Friend is actually a secret boss is if it is somehow not actually the Tail of Hell. If anything, they're probably just going to drop right in at the very end of Chapter 5, like how the Knight did in Chapter 3, and then we'll either fight them right there, or it leads into a cliffhanger for Chapter 6, where they become the chapter's main boss. I will be expecting a fully written apology from all Image Friend Secret Boss believers in the near future when I am proven 100% correct on June 24th. Thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe, I guess. I don't know. Maybe I might do something again with this channel in the future, and let's pray to God that Chapter 5 is good.